You can go ahead, Carolyn.
Okay. Thank you all for joining us today for this webinar on the Food Safety Modernization Act. This webinar is sponsored by the regional offices of the Council of State Governments and State Agriculture and Rural Leaders. I'm Carolyn Orr, and I serve as the Agriculture Policy Analyst for the Midwest and Eastern regions of the Conference of Council of State Governments, as well as the Executive Secretary for State Agriculture and Rural Leaders. I'm joined today by Jonathan Watts-Hull, who is the Senior Policy Analyst for Agriculture for the Southern Legislative Conference, which is the Southern Office of the Council of State Governments. And we both want to thank Heather Perkins in the CSG Lexington office for all of her help in pulling this together and making the trains run on time. I'd like to take care of a few housekeeping items first. You are all in the listen-only mode. If you wish to ask a question, please use the question box on your GoToWebinar toolbar. We will be recording this webinar and posting it later on the CSG Knowledge Center website. You can access that at knowledgecenter.csg.org or go to the csg.org website and look for Knowledge Center. It will also be available through the SLC website, which is slcatlanta.org. By way of background, the Food Safety Modernization Act was signed into law in 2011. It represents the most significant revision of food safety laws in the United States in more than 70 years. It will significantly, financially, and in other ways, impact our farmers, our processors, and the entire agriculture and food industry. CSG and SARL are hosting this webinar in an effort to keep state officials aware of the issues that impact their constituents and their communities. We will host similar programs about the Farm Bill as it begins to move in Congress or other issues that are important to you. At the end of this webinar, if you'd like assistance in submitting comments on this legislation, please let John or I know. We are joined by three speakers today that will follow each other. We won't introduce in between them. Our first speaker is Fran Boyd, who is Senior Vice President at Myers & Associates, a leading agriculture law firm in Washington, D.C. He will be followed by Robert Gunther, who is the Senior Vice President for Public Policy with the United Fresh Produce Association, and Roger Noon, who is President of the New England Farmers Union, and he's also a produce owner of the Middle Branch Farm in New Boston, New Hampshire. We'll start our program with Fran Boyd. Please feel free to submit your questions as they come up through the program, and we'll turn to as many as we have time for at the end. Thank you for joining us. Fran?
Hello all, this is Fran Boyd in Washington, D.C. First of all, it's a pleasure to be addressing you today across the country to talk a little bit about the Food Safety and Modernization Act. You try the next slide if you would, please. The Food Safety and Modernization Act is a historical piece of legislation that President Obama signed in January of 2011. The Act brings the Food and Drug Administration working with a wide range of public and private partners to build a new system of food safety oversight, one focused on applying more comprehensively than ever in the past the best available science and good common sense, hopefully, to prevent the problems that can make people sick. This all came about over many, many years, but what really brought it to the head, in my opinion, is the listeria and cantaloupe outbreak with 33 deaths and people being sick with salmonella and peanut butter. This brought it forward. The other thing that's important is that a driving force on the beginning of this comprehensive food safety bill was imported food. Next slide, please. The law, just a basic overview, and we'll go into much more detail as we go through the panelists. It gives new and stronger authorities to FDA, the Food and Drug Administration. Processors of all types of food will now be required, or will be required, to evaluate the hazards in their operations, import, and to monitor effective measures to prevent the contamination, and have a plan in place to take any corrective action that is necessary. It gives the agency the authority to order recalls, ability to shift food safety approach from responding to preventing outbreaks. That is the major underlying goal of the legislation is to try to prevent increased authority in FDA and the inspection and compliance authorities, and greater oversight over imported food. Also, the law provides the authority to collaborate with other agencies and improve training for food safety officials. Next slide, please. FDA, after almost 2 years, proposed the two major proposed rules. The first rule is the rule for preventative controls for human food, and the second is the proposed rule for produce. And we will discuss those later. Both of these rules have received extensive comment from all sectors, and just recently the FDA has decided to extend the comment period, which was expiring at the end of May, to another 120 days. So that comment period will now go into September before it closes. After that time, the agency will have time to review all the comments and then come forward with a final rule on these two. Next slide, please. There are three other pieces of the law that we anticipate seeing after this. More proposed rules to be coming. One will be the proposed rules on how to handle imported food. Also, feed manufacturer and the third-party verification rules, and that should complete most of the regulatory part of this. Next slide, please. As I said, the comment period has been extended to September 16th, and as you can see on the screen, if you have not sent comments into FDA on the proposed rules, there's still plenty of time, and those are the sites to send them forward to. The last thing that I would like to comment about is the cost of all this. Recently, in the President's proposed budget for Food and Drug Administration, it requested a budget of $4.7 billion for fiscal year 2014, including $295+ million to implement the new food safety regulation. The proposed budget for FY14 represents an increase of over $4.3 billion included in the 2013 budget after automatic spending cuts mandated by Congress, known as the sequestration, which I'm sure you're familiar with. The interesting thing about this is that the budget includes proposed user fees on food safety, if enacted in the legislation, to help pay for the cost or to pay for the majority of the cost of the Food Safety Modernization Act and what it will do to the agency's resources. So as I said, this is an extensive piece of law with many, many years of work. Many agencies were very, very involved in it, and it is a huge undertaking for the FDA to implement this, both in regulation and then to make sure that it's carried out and there are increased inspection authority. So with that, I will, Carolyn, I will end here and we can move to our other panelists.
Robert?
Okay, thank you, Carolyn, and thanks, Fran, for that really good overview of kind of the broad structure of the regulations around the Food Safety Modernization Act. What I plan to do today is go a little bit deeper into the produce proposed rule for produce, and kind of talk a little bit about that, some of the things that are in the proposed rule, and then kind of talk briefly about how we see, kind of after digesting a lot of this, kind of how we see the proposed rule kind of from the view of the fresh produce industry. Before I start, a little quick background on United Fresh. We've been around since 1904. We're a national trade association for the fresh produce industry, from grower all the way up through the distribution chain to consumers. So we represent a broad cross-section of the produce industry, both domestically and internationally. So as Fran mentioned, there's 5 different rules that are associated with this, this new law, 5 major rules. Produce industry is in a unique position. We're directly impacted by all of them, quite frankly. The produce rule in particular is of major concern or major discussion point. The food facility rule is, Fran mentioned, and then also the foreign supplier verification and the other, the record keep, excuse me, the third-party certification and the animal feed rule also even have an impact on the fresh produce industry. So we're very anxious to see all the 5 rules come out so we can kind of look at these collectively, because we look at this issue as each of these are different puzzle pieces to the broader issue of food safety for the fresh produce industry, and we need to see how they will be interacting together, or how FDA views them as interacting together as we move forward. So while we have a extension of the comment period, as Fran mentioned, till September, obviously these other 3 rules are very important to get them out as soon as possible, so again, we can see kind of how they all interact in a way that's going to impact the fresh produce industry quite significantly. You can go to the first slide, please. So basically, I mean, it's already been mentioned, I think Carolyn and Fran both mentioned this, the extent of the produce produce safety proposed rule really establishes a science-based minimum standards for the safe production and harvesting of produce. And again, Carolyn mentioned this. I think it's without argument the most significant revision to food safety laws in this country since 1938. It's the first major revision of any food safety laws in the last 70-plus years in the country. So it's a huge impact, not just on produce, but the entire food industry. So what did it bring us? When the proposed rules came out in January of this year, about 1,000 pages of regulations, proposed regulations to read over. FDA used basically a little bit over 500 scientific, economic, and industry references to support a lot of the justifications they put into this proposed rule. Excuse me. And also FDA, in the issuing of this proposed rule, asked over 110 questions, both in the produce rule and the preventive controls food facility rule, that they're asking the food industry kind of, what do you think about what we did? What do you think, about our issue regarding to ag testing? Is testing once a week appropriate? Should we have finished product testing, or what kind of, how extensive record keeping should be? So they've put this out there, yet they've asked a lot of questions. So as you look at this, and as most of you recall, I suspect the actual original deadline for the comments was May 16th. And after reading through all this, we really realized that we needed definitely a lot more time to review this, and so we can really prepare good, solid, reliable comments that really reflect the industry's views on these proposed rules. I will point out one thing, though. After all of this, these thousands of pages and us going through this, I'll point to you one page, page 3537 of the Federal Register. And that really summed up a lot of things that when we first saw the proposed rule, and you can go to the next slide, this really summed up, after reading all that, a lot of interest in the fresh produce industry. You had a list. FDA, rightly or wrongly, produced this list, and they said, these commodities are covered, these commodities are exempt. And I will be honest with you, we spent quite an amount of time of trying to figure out, why it was covered, why it was exempt. The industry had a lot of questions about this. It was, after all this, work and FDA did, a lot of the industry focused a lot on covered versus exempt produce. I'll mention a few things in here. For instance, the citrus industry is interested in why are we on the covered produce exempt, and we've not really had any food safety outbreaks in fresh citrus. There was an article recently in the roll call here in Washington, D.C. alluding to that. The apple industry has the same concerns. Why are we being held to the same standards that we all support food safety, but why are we are being held to the same standards as some of the commodities that have been most susceptible to food safety outbreaks, like lettuce, cantaloupes, tomatoes, other commodities. On the other side of the list, you've got commodities like kale that were exempt. Now, I tell you right now that a lot of restaurants I go to, I don't go to a lot, but at least ones I do, A lot of them have fresh kale salads on their menus now. So it's a fascinating part of why, kind of trying to get around FDA's views of why they put this list together in the way they did. Next slide, please. So which categories of produce are covered? And this gives you a little bit of insight of that list that I just showed you. Basically, produce is defined as a fruit and vegetable. Pretty simple, pretty basic. It also includes mushrooms, sprouts, herbs, and tree nuts. It does not include grains. So I know there's been questions about that and other commodities that are part of the food world, but it is really focused mostly on fresh fruits and vegetables. So how did some of the commodities get put on that exempt list? The main issue when you look at FDA and you dig down into some of the scientific justifications that they put forward in their qualitative risk assessment was really they looked at produce that's rarely consumed raw. So things like potatoes, things like black-eyed peas, Brussels sprouts, that really was where most of the decisions were made of why you were on that exempt list versus the covered produce. Also, produce used for personal consumption is not covered. And then also produce that is subject to processing or manufacture, which requires actually it's basically a kill step, but also requires registration under the food facility section. Next slide, please. So now we know what produce is covered. Which farms are covered? So domestic and foreign farms that grow, harvest, pack, and hold covered produce with an average food sales during the previous 3-year period of $25,000 US or more. And then farms of mixed type facilities is also covered, and we can talk about that at some point if there's any questions related to that. So what is exempt, or what FDA deems qualified exemption? These are farms with average food sales of less than $500,000 that sell primarily to consumers, located within a 275-mile radius of customers or within a state. This is what's known as the Tester Amendment. Senator Tester got this amendment put in related to farms and food facilities, and FDA pretty much went by the letter of law related to this exemption or qualified exemption as they call it. However, FDA went one step further. They also exempted farms that were less than $25,000 in food sales or gross income on their farms. That was not in the law. So there's a lot of questions about that right now that we have, and I'll get to a slide that kind of highlights some of these questions. What does this mean related to this? How does this apply to international or foreign farms that are under 25,000? I can tell you that some of our members are concerned because, for instance, there's a lot of small farms, apple farms in China that may be exempt from this, based on this 25,000. Because again, it's not just domestic. These exemptions also apply to farms that are in other locations or outside the U.S. borders. Next slide. So which hazards are covered? Actually, this area they did pretty well, and they identified 5 different hazards that are covered. These are pretty recognizable. If anybody is participating in good ag practices, these are GAP types of areas that they've identified as hazards that are covered. So when you look at this, at least the first 5: worker training, health and hygiene, the agriculture, water, biological soil amendments, domestic and wild animals, equipment, tools, and buildings. These areas are covered under the proposed rules. So things related to this that you do on your farm, there will be requirements that are based on FDA's requirements. I can tell you right now, the ag water provision is very controversial. There's going to be a lot of discussion about the attention to that and the requirements, record-keeping requirements related to ag water testing that FDA has proposed, and there'll be a lot of discussion as this proposed rules move forward into final rules of how to address that. And then interestingly enough, despite the fact that they've tried to somewhat lump all the different produce into one category, they decided to go commodity specific and develop a separate sprout recommendation. So when you look at the law, if you go back and look in the law and it says commodity specific risk-based approach, they ignored some of that and put all the other commodities into one group, basically covered produce or not covered, yet they distinguished out sprouts as a particular area for them. So it's interesting why they decided to do that. It kind of taken a little bit of the law and put things where they thought they fit best, and then other places they put where they could try to capture as many commodities as they possibly could. So in terms of this, it focuses on, when you look at this, it really focuses on identified routes of microbial contamination, and it considers risks posed by practices and commodities. So you see practice-based in the first 5, but also in the sprouts you see commodities. Next slide, please. So what other things are included in the proposed produce safety rule? Alternatives are permitted. They allow for science-based alternatives that are equivalent or are permitted related to water and biological soil amendments of animal origin. Now, interesting enough, they only decided, if you think about the 5 areas, including that I just mentioned, they only allow for alternatives in ag, water, and biological soil amendments. They did not allow for alternatives in worker training, health and hygiene, domestic wild animals, or equipment, tools, and building. And again, we think that's a major issue related to this proposed rule. Why only those 2? Why not all 5? Why can't we have flexibility in this proposed rule that allows for alternatives that growers and commodity groups can provide FDA that are science-based and meet the same standards that FDA has put out as standards for this proposed rule? They've also allowed for variances to provide for flexibility. U.S. state or foreign countries may petition FDA for a variance from some of the or all the revisions if deemed necessary in light of growing conditions. This area we think is an important part, again, that we believe strongly that commodities that have a good food safety plan should be able to petition FDA and say our food safety plan is equivalent or is adequate to address the needs that you have provided in this proposed rule and as the law has deemed necessary, again, to provide minimum safety, scientific-based safety standards for fresh produce. So another important part that we're going to be focusing a lot of time on in our members is this issue related to alternatives and variances, is make sure that those are flexible and usable, adequate enough that commodities can use these in a way that they feel that is based on science, can feel and use to help provide more flexibility in this rule once it becomes final. There's also record-keeping requirements, as I mentioned, in particular related to ag water testing. So go on to the next slide, please. So what are the compliance dates? Basically 60 days after publishing a final rule is when this would go into effect. Interestingly enough, while the law did put strict prescription requirements on when the proposed rule should be issued, they did not put necessarily requirements in under the requirement of when to publish a final rule. Once it does, though, there will be a set of staggering implementation for very small farms. You have 4 years of compliance, small farms 3 years, and then other covered farms 2 years. And you can see also for this water requirement, they've added additional time frames as well. Next slide. So we have spent, since these proposed rules have been published in January, we've spent an extensive amount of time on both of them. We've created working groups. United Fresh has put together a FSMA working group, Food Safety Modernization Act working groups on the proposed rules, one on the produce rule, and one on the food facility rule. There have been 3 public meetings that FDA has hosted, one here in D.C., one in Chicago, and one in Oregon. Those have concluded at the end of March. And we have now started collecting information from a lot of our members. And really the things we are looking at as we kind of go into this process of framing our comments and framing what things we think are important, these are 5 or 6 different areas that I think we feel very important that we need to address in the proposed rule. I would say that we oppose the concept of producers of any size should be exempt from the basic rule. We feel that we've had a very strong opinion about this throughout the process when the law was being considered, when the Tester Amendment came up, that there is no science-based standard that says, or proof that says that, depending on what size of farm you are, you're more safe than other farms. So we have a strong opposition to that. We are also concerned about produce commodities that are wholly exempt from the rule. Certainly, we think that that bugs do not really have know if they're on a big farm or small farm, what commodity they are on. So we feel that this necessarily needs to be addressed in the proposed rule as well. As I mentioned, the exemption list versus the covered list, we think that should be part of guidance rather than regulation. That's something we're going to be focusing some of our comments on. That really says that this could change. These lists can change. If you're going to have a list, these lists can change, and they're easier to change within guidance versus a regulation where you have to come back in and open up the regulation to consider what would be exempt or what would be covered. And then also, I mentioned the alternative list is too restrictive. We think this should be open to at least all 5 of those requirements. Alternatives should be able to be proposed by growers and by commodity groups. We think also the rule is inadequate for petitioning for variances. Again, leaving it to the states and foreign governments to be the only groups that can apply for a variance, we think is too restrictive. If the California citrus industry or the Washington apple industry or the Florida citrus industry has a citrus food safety plan that they feel is adequate and it meets the same safety standards as the FDA rule, they should be able to go directly to FDA to petition for that variance. The issue of farm and food facility is very blurred in this proposed rule. FDA spent about 3 or 4 pages worth of the regulation, the preamble, to kind of describe what a farm and food facility. Quite frankly, we think they're trying to expand the definition of food facility too broadly, and therefore we really need to have, for farmers and for growers and for even folks who have both a farm and a food facility on their farm, there needs to be a really strong, bright line that says this is a farm and this is a food facility, and there's no gray area. And right now, the way they've drafted both the produce rule and the food facility rule, there's a lot of gray that it's really hard to determine what really constitutes when you shift from a farm and be subject to this produce rule to a facility, which then you'd be subject to the food facility rule. And then also, finally, the segregation of processed and fresh produce under the rule. This is an issue that's highlighted. As I mentioned before, if there is a produce item that has a kill step that goes to further processing or manufacturing, we want to make sure that there's strong language in there related to segregation, that some of that product, if it did not adhere to the same food safety standards, was destined for process, may leak back into the fresh side, that it does not get, we want to ensure the integrity of the segregation is maintained throughout the process. And that's kind of my slides, and I think I can turn it over to Roger now. Thank you very much.
Thank you. And thanks to Fran and Robert for those presentations. So my presentation, since I knew these gentlemen were going to cover specifics on the rule, is a little different. I'm going to focus mostly on the impacts of your local farms and the resources in and around where all you folks represent. Next slide, please. So I'm with the New England Farmers Union. It's part of the National Farmers Union, which is a family farm advocacy organization. It's 111 years old. We're one of the newer chapters representing family farmers and fishermen in the New England region. Next slide, please. I'm the president, and I own and operate a diversified organic family farm. So not only do I have to advocate and educate on this rule, I also have to live with its potential implementation. Next slide. Growing consumer demand, and this is from a Rabobank report, which I read in the Packer, which is a United Fresh publication. And I want to inform you folks about how we get the rule looking like it is today. To some extent. So we have growing consumer demand for local foods. It's reached a tipping point, developing into a strong mainstream trend over the past decade, creating a structural and competitive shift in the U.S. food industry. Next slide. And you all probably see this in your districts and your hometowns, the increased farmers market, local food at restaurants, local food on the grocery stores. Even members of United Fresh are now, trying to highlight the local component. We've had this trend continuing now for about 10 years, and it's projected to continue and expand for the next 5 years. Next slide, please. Buying local makes an impact, and this is from the Emergence of Retail Agriculture report released by Farm Credit Council. Direct farm-to-consumer sales account for nearly $8 billion of sales, and I believe that is more than cotton and peanuts. And the demand is rising. We've had USDA support that over the last 5 years with the Know Your Farmer, Know Your Food initiative, the increased demand of food hubs, and we've seen an increase in our penetration from hyper-local deeper into the food value chain. I'll take the next slide. Local foods displace summer business of growers and shippers in California. Again, this is from that Rabobank report. Some Western growers reported 10 to 15% drop in sales during the summer months. That's a fairly significant industry, and as I mentioned to Hank Gickless when I saw him in Washington, D.C. back in February, Hank, if you give us our 3 months of summer sales, we'll gladly let you keep getting subsidized water to grow spinach in the desert. Next slide, please. So action needed to be taken, and this is one of my favorite pictures, and maybe Robert will enjoy it as well because it shows somebody eating raw corn, which is typically not eaten raw. Next slide. So action was the Food Safety Modernization Act. I know that there are food safety issues that are important to all farmers, and there have been outbreaks, and there is long been a history of voluntary practices on farms, both large and small, often required by the buyers as well as industry groups. Food Safety Modernization Act signed into law January 4th. Next slide, please. And our staff, it was just a little light reading for a small organization, and that's really just a fraction of the documents that had to be poured through. Next slide, please. And I want to get into just some of the particular issues that are important to your small farms and your local farms. And I almost am hesitant to use the word small farm. We are small businesses. This rule adversely impacts small businesses. I've just highlighted the trends we've seen in markets, the increased demand, and this rule is going to limit these small and mid-sized farms' access to markets for a host of reasons. The farm is defined under FDA's organizing principles, and I think Robert touched on this, growing and harvesting its own raw agricultural commodities and preparing them for use as food. As soon as a farm buys in something from another farm, which is common, go out and talk to your farmers, folks. This is a common practice. We don't have enough sweet corn, we'll buy in some sweet corn to fill this order. Then they've become a mixed type farm facility that will trigger preventive controls, which represents a whole new layer of regulatory burden and expense associated with it. FDA has estimated the cost to comply with the produce rule alone for a small farm at about $13,000. I calculated under the ag water requirements for my farm what it would cost me under the proposed rule, and it was around $7,000. So I was already halfway there just on ag water. FDA admits they do not have a real good handle on what the costs are for this. The ownership is referred to often but not defined. What about cooperative ownership? We have farmers that cooperatively own land or own it through land companies and swap that land back and forth. How they define where a farm is in the general location. If my packing shed is not on the physical farm homestead but on maybe a rented building I use, is that not in the general area? So there are, whereas Robert said, we would like a bright line on some of these things. Some of the terms are extremely vague. And we need some clarity there. But we should not rule out cooperative ownership or other structures that are common, especially for those small farms and mid-sized farms that are aggregating through what USDA has termed food hubs to get deeper penetration into these markets. Next slide, please. We also see a lot of environmental impact on this, and we asked the FDA to conduct an environmental impact assessment. The increased use of groundwater and public water resources, because the cost of testing your surface water, which I'm in the Northeast, we have a lot of surface water, and that is historically what we've used for fertilizing, for irrigating our crops. And this may force some farmers to tap into groundwater resources, which would have a negative impact on our already taxed aquifers in these suburbanized and urbanized areas in the Northeast. Due to the manure rule under the biological soil amendments of an animal origin and the 270-day manure rule, which I'm not sure, but in the Northeast, 270 days to before you can apply manure, before you can harvest a crop, that basically takes a field out of production for the year. So you may see either you're going to see a lot of late, early fall applications of manure, where it may be, and heavy applications where it may be subject to runoff and cause water quality issues, or you may see the increased use of synthetic fertilizers and the increased stockpiling of manure, creation of more composting facilities, all of which will add cost to the producer, all of which will also potentially create resource concerns with water quality. The FDA also concedes the cost of compliance will likely put some farms out of business at the lower end of the spectrum. Farms in my area, in New England, represent some of our best stewards of our soil and water resources, and many may convert their land to other uses, potentially further increasing the environmental impact of this rule. We see a lot of issues with negative environmental outcomes associated with this rule. Next slide, please. FSMA furthermore creates a significant regulatory business not only for small businesses but also burdens public interests. The cost of compliance are disproportionately borne by smaller farms. The FDA estimated, I think it was $150 per acre. Well, if I've got 1,000 acres, I can better absorb that cost than if I have 50 acres. Small farms will have restricted access to expanding markets, causing us to fall into preventive controls to aggregate product or use cooperative business models will definitely put us out of some market opportunities. There will be increased demands made on our public resources. Robert talked about alternatives. Where are those alternatives going to come from? They're going to come from the land-grant university and its extension service. Small farms are not going to be able to hire their own science, research firms to develop these alternatives. They're going to have to come from public resources. And that is, in the Northeast, in New England in particular, our land grants and our extension services are already suffering from tremendous cuts. The Natural Resource Conservation Services and our Soil and Water Conservation Districts will see increased demand for applicable conservation practices to mitigate the impacts of this rule. Fencing out fencing out fields to keep wild animals from coming into your fields. Creation of man-made reservoirs for irrigation water that aren't subject to runoff. Fencing out waterways. Perhaps even we'll see more increased clearing of riparian buffers to reduce the potential for contamination in your water sources. This is, small farms are all for food safety. We have no, if this rule is to really be science and risk-based, the risk from the small and mid-sized farms entering the food value chain has not been substantively indicated in the documents that FDA has provided. Next slide. I think that's the last one. And thank you very much, and I appreciate the opportunity to present before all of you.
Well, thank you, all of our speakers and our audience. We do have time for a few questions. I have a few here. If you're looking at your screen, there's a little box on the probably right side of your screen that will give you an opportunity to send a question in privately, and we will direct it to the panelists. The first question comes out of Oregon, and it's a pretty direct question. I'll just open it up. It says, how will the proposed rule impact the shell egg regulatory business or the shell egg business in general?
Well, This is Robert. I mean, certainly under the food facility rule, there may be some impact. Not necessarily, it's not subject to the produce rule. So, but certainly under the facility rule, if the facility, if their facility is deemed as a, under bioterrorism or a registered facility, then they would be impacted by that proposed rule. Which is a whole other set of, we could have a whole nother webinar on that rule as well.
Okay, another question, this one coming out of New Hampshire. Question, do states' lines or borders override the 275-mile radius rule?
What was that?
I can try to
No, under the exemption?
Yeah.
Under the exemption?
Yeah, under the exemption, no. It's within state or 275 miles from the farm. So if you're in California, you've got the entire state of California or Texas. If you're in Rhode Island, you've got Rhode Island plus 275 miles around your farm.
Yeah, Roger's right. That's exactly right.
Oh, we will. I'm not seeing any other questions coming in, unless Heather has some that have yet to be pushed. I'm going to give a minute or two and take this opportunity to thank our speakers once again for their contributions and to thank all of y'all for spending an hour of your afternoon with us. I hope everyone found it useful. Ma'am?
Jonathan, can I ask a question? Could our speakers explain perhaps from their viewpoint how the FDA is going to accomplish all these inspections and all this work in a time of sequestration and decreasing budgets?
This is Fran. Basically, my opinion is you saw a reflection of that in the increased, in the President's budget for the increased amount of funding to implement this. They will have a very difficult time without more resources doing it. What's required under the bill goes very far, and as Robert said, we've only seen 2 proposed rules so far. Also, in my opinion, the underlying language is very, very broad in how FDA actually implements the authority that they have. I think that you will see them reach out to state organizations to assist them through contracting to do a lot of this work. They just don't have all the resources at FDA to do it.
And Fran, I also believe they proposed user fees associated with this, or inspection fees.
Yes, in the President's budget, yes. But that would take legislative change. And I don't know if Robert has an opinion, but I don't think that the odds right now of implementing user fees, I would say, are not really good.
I would agree with that, and agree with everything you said, Fran. I think that the fee issue, to Roger's point, it's been in the President's budget. I think the industry and others, a lot of people have opposed these types of fees, the food industry has in particular, and will continue to probably do so, these types of fees. And I think, this is, the big question is, we're going through this process. We're going to have new requirements placed on food operations from growers all the way up through the food distribution chain. The question then is how do you ensure that people are adhering to these new rules once they come into place? And that's a big question. It deals with money and budgets, and to Fran's point, definitely think states are going to be very involved with this and having discussions with FDA and others about what kind of partnerships they can create. I know Mike Taylor and others have spent a lot of time talking about that. There's going to be partnerships within the industries, quite frankly, to try to figure out how everybody is how we're assuring that the industry is adhering to these new requirements once they come into online.
Okay, I'll ask again if there's any other questions, and also if there's any final comments from any of our panelists, if any closing remarks that they'd like to make before we wrap up here. Hearing none, I want to again say thank you to all of y'all for taking your time this afternoon with us. If you find after this closes you have questions or you want to need more information about the Food Safety Modernization Act and making comments on the regulations, remember we have time until September to do that. Please go ahead and contact either me or Carolyn, and we'll do our best to answer them or direct them where they need to be. Also, feel free to give us any feedback you may have on this webinar. You can send that to us by email. My email is jhull@csg.org. Carolyn is available at corr@sarl.us. This webinar will be available for viewing in a day or so through the CSG Knowledge Center at knowledgecenter.csg.org. It will also be available on the Southern Legislative Conference website at slcatlanta.org/webinars. We'll be posting the speaker presentations as well, so you can take those with you. Finally, a big thanks to Heather Perkins in the CSG Lexington office for all of her help today. If there's anything more that the CSG or the regional offices of the Council of State Governments or the state ag-rural leaders can do for you in your work, please don't hesitate to let us know. Thanks so much, and have a great day. Thank you to all of you.
Thank you.
Thank you.